authorities are bracing for a major impact. According to Port of Seattle Commissioner Ryan Culkins, there could be a 40% drop in vessels and container traffic the next few weeks.
That means we lose less money, you know. When I see that, that means we lose less money.
Over 400,000 shipping containers are currently sitting idle or delayed at some of the largest ports in the United States. According to a Reuters report from May 9, 2025, 6 major container shipping routes between China and the U.S. were suspended in a single week, disrupting trans-Pacific trade at a scale not seen since the COVID-era backlog. Meanwhile, Bloomberg reports that American businesses are scrambling to bring in goods before a temporary tariff reprieve expires a 90-day window, during which the Trump administration has reduced tariffs on Chinese imports from an aggressive 145% to a still punitive 30%. After this period, the administration has suggested the full tariff rate could be reinstated without further notice. This perfect storm of policy whiplash, logistical overextension, and geopolitical unpredictability has pushed the U.S. supply chain to the brink. Ports that were already operating at near capacity have been overwhelmed by a sudden surge of incoming freight triggered not by natural demand, but by a panic-driven rush to beat tariff deadlines. The ripple effect is being felt nationwide, from warehouse bottlenecks and trucking shortages to inventory crises for retailers and manufacturers. And beneath it all lies a critical question. How did a trade policy designed to project strength end up paralyzing the very infrastructure it was meant to protect? At its core, this crisis illustrates the cost of erratic unilateral economic decision-making. Unlike traditional tariff negotiations, which unfold over months through WTO mechanisms or bilateral talks, the current trade measures were enacted and then partially suspended via executive declaration. Businesses caught in the middle are left to navigate unpredictable regulatory shifts with little time to adapt, and supply chains built on precision timing and global coordination have no buffer for volatility of this scale. In other words, the system isn't failing because of demand or capacity. It's failing because it was designed for volume, not volatility. And when public policy injects panic into global logistics, even the most resilient infrastructure can buckle under the strain. The U.S. logistics network is facing a critical imbalance, not due to long-term structural failure, but because of what experts are now calling a state of localized oversupply and systemic underservice. In practical terms, this means some U.S. ports are flooded with goods, while others and the inland distribution systems that support them are choked, disorganized, or simply unprepared. According to a Bloomberg report dated May 22, 2025, major ports, including Los Angeles, Long Beach, and Savannah, have been pushed to breaking points by a sudden sharp surge in container arrivals. This influx is not a product of organic market growth, but a defensive, over-ordering response from American importers rushing to bring in goods before punitive tariffs potentially snap back to 145%. Warehouses in Southern California are overflowing, yard space is at a premium, and longshore workers are clocking in overtime even as queues of vessels build off the coast. Some containers are now sitting idle for over 2 weeks, a delay that cascades down to every level of the economy. The problem, however, is not just volume, it's coordination. U.S. port systems, especially on the west and southeast coasts, lack the labor flexibility and digital infrastructure to dynamically reroute, offload, and process cargo at the pace necessary to meet these sudden shifts. Customs processing is often still manual and fragmented between federal, state, and private actors. As one logistics analyst told Bloomberg, the problem isn't that we don't have enough capacity, it's that we don't have the capacity where we need it, when we need it. Worse yet, the international response has been swift and damaging. Several major ocean freight carriers have begun reducing or suspending trans-Pacific routes between China and the U.S. altogether, citing extreme uncertainty around tariffs and regulatory risk. With policy changes occurring by executive order and little notice given to international partners, shippers are increasingly viewing the U.S. as an unstable trade destination. As a result, carriers are diverting vessels to ports in Mexico, Canada, or even Latin America, where customs regimes are less volatile and throughput more predictable. In essence, the U.S. is importing instability into its own ports, not from the outside, but from within its own trade policy apparatus. A system designed for throughput and scale is now throttled by fear, short-term thinking, and a lack of operational resilience. And the damage may outlast the current crisis if foreign logistics providers continue to view the American market as a high-risk environment for long-term reliability. Before we start with the next part, don't forget to subscribe for more breaking news. At the heart of the current logistics crisis lies a profound failure of trade policy execution, a textbook case of what supply chain experts now refer to as policy whiplash. On April 1, 2025, the Trump administration reinstated a sweeping 145% tariff on Chinese imports, bypassing traditional legislative oversight and multilateral consultation. The move, enacted via executive authority and without prior coordination with the World Trade Organization or key trading partners, sent shockwaves through the global supply chain almost overnight. The rationale was framed around economic fairness and protecting U.S. manufacturing. But instead of fostering domestic production, the abruptness and scale of the measure triggered panic among U.S. businesses, particularly import-dependent sectors like retail, automotive, electronics, and construction. With virtually no time to adjust contracts or sourcing strategies, thousands of businesses faced a stark choice: either absorb crippling cost increases or scramble to accelerate imports ahead of the tariffs taking full effect. In a surprising reversal, the administration announced in mid-May a temporary rollback of tariffs to 30% for a 90-day window intended ostensibly to ease immediate pressure. However, this partial reprieve only amplified the chaos. Companies rushed to flood U.S. ports with last-minute shipments to take advantage of the temporary rate reduction, further overwhelming an already strained system. The result was a paradoxical glut. Warehouses overflowed with excess goods, but many of those goods could not reach end users because trucking, rail, and customs infrastructure were gridlocked. Small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs, bore the brunt of this instability. Without the cash reserves of larger corporations, many over-leveraged themselves to import early, only to find that storage costs, fulfillment delays, and slower-than-expected retail turnover quickly drained their working capital. For some, the gamble proved fatal. Multiple small business coalitions have since petitioned the Department of Commerce for emergency relief, citing the unpredictable and self-defeating nature of the policy timeline. In short, what was intended as a show of strength in international trade became a case study in domestic economic self-sabotage. The lack of interagency coordination, absence of stakeholder consultation, and volatile back-and-forth implementation turned a policy tool into a market destabilizer, disrupting not only the global flow of goods, but also the financial viability of the very businesses it claimed to defend. The ripple effects of America's trade policy volatility are now being felt far beyond ports and policy circles. They are hitting the core of the consumer economy, stretching from big-box retailers to small-town manufacturers. What began as a tariff strategy aimed at foreign competition has morphed into a domestic disruption, with consequences reverberating through nearly every layer of the U.S. supply chain. According to Reuters reporting in May 2025, major retailers like Walmart, Home Depot, and Target are facing serious inventory shortages heading into the summer season. Shelves that should be stocked with home improvement goods, seasonal products, and consumer electronics remain partially empty, not because of declining demand, but because key components and finished goods are still sitting in ports, stuck in customs, or delayed in backlogged warehouses. With lead times extended and replenishment cycles broken, retailers are being forced to scale back promotions, delay restocks, and in some cases, cancel orders altogether. The disruption isn't confined to retail. Trucking companies and freight brokers, which serve as the connective tissue of American commerce, are reporting rising layoffs and route cancellations. With containers piling up in coastal terminals and inland distribution centers overwhelmed, long-haul truckers are facing longer idle times, fewer hauls, and rising fuel and labor costs, leading some firms to suspend operations or furlough drivers. Meanwhile, warehouse facilities are running over capacity, with storage fees increasing and logistics providers passing costs down the chain. For small and mid-sized manufacturers, particularly in the South and Midwest, where industries often rely on just-in-time inventory from Asian suppliers, the situation is becoming critical. Thousands of these firms, lacking both inventory buffers and capital reserves, have been forced to halt or scale back production due to shortages of basic components such as circuit boards, plastics, or machine parts. In industries ranging from automotive to consumer goods, entire production lines are now idle, not because of demand collapse, but because of supply gridlock. These conditions have also triggered price inflation at the consumer level. With reduced availability of goods and higher back-end costs, the retail price of many everyday items from tools to toys has risen sharply. For American consumers, the consequence is twofold: fewer choices and higher prices, especially in lower-income regions where substitution options are limited. Ultimately, what we're witnessing is not just a supply chain crisis, It's a cascading failure of economic coordination, where protectionist policy logistics capacity and market behavior are misaligned. The result is a scenario where consumers pay more, businesses earn less, and workers lose jobs, the exact opposite of what trade policy is supposed to achieve. As the economic disruption deepens, Washington's political response has been marked more by division than direction. While the nation's supply chains groan under the weight of unpredictable policy, the conversation in the Capitol has largely devolved into partisan blame games with little in the way of coherent long-term strategy. Former President Donald Trump has framed the 145% tariff imposition and its temporary rollback as a strategic victory for American leverage on the world stage. In campaign events and press statements, he has characterized the policy as a bold move to force China back to the negotiating table and reassert U.S. manufacturing dominance. But the economic fallout from supply chain gridlock to rising consumer prices has complicated that narrative. Even within the federal government, the picture is less unified than the messaging suggests. According to internal briefings leaked to Reuters, the U.S. Treasury Department has acknowledged that the reimposed tariffs have contributed directly to renewed inflationary pressure, particularly in the consumer goods and retail sectors. Price volatility in essential categories like tools, electronics, and home goods has reemerged despite overall inflation trending downward prior to the policy shift. Meanwhile, Democratic leaders have seized on the fallout to attack the administration's approach, branding the trade maneuver as political theater at the expense of real businesses. Lawmakers such as Senator Elizabeth Warren and Representative Ro Khanna have warned that small and mid-sized firms are being sacrificed in a policy experiment designed more for headlines than for impact. In hearings and op-eds, they've accused the administration of failing to consult stakeholders and of disregarding the downstream effects on domestic logistics labor and consumer welfare. At the legislative level, Congress remains paralyzed. Despite growing bipartisan concern about the unchecked use of executive authority in trade, Matter's attempts to pass reform bills that would limit presidential powers to impose or alter tariffs without congressional approval have stalled. Competing proposals differ on scope, and entrenched party interests have made consensus elusive. As a result, the legal framework that enabled such rapid and disruptive tariff shifts remains fully intact with no oversight mechanism in place. In effect, the U.S. is repeating the mistakes of previous trade conflicts, pursuing aggressive unilateral measures without institutional safeguards, interagency coordination, or long-term planning. The result is a policy landscape driven by soundbites rather than strategy, and a supply chain that remains dangerously exposed to political volatility. The current congestion isn't caused by too little supply, it's caused by too much policy chaos. U.S. ports and supply chains are overwhelmed not by demand, but by a lack of coherent planning and trade policy. What was once a global hub of logistics is now bogged down by reactive, unpredictable tariff shifts. Businesses don't know how to plan, carriers don't know where to go, and the economy pays the price. Unless the U.S. reintroduces stability and coordination into trade strategy, it risks doing more than jamming ports. It may end up triggering a self-inflicted recession not from foreign threats but from within.